For the longest time, if you asked me what my favorite game was, I would give a non-committal answer. Picking just one was too hard, so I gave 5 with a whole lot of caveats. Those titles were The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time, The Elder Scrolls IV: Oblivion, Persona 3, 9 Hours, 9 Persons, 9 Doors, and Journey, all of which are formative experiences displaying the breadth of genres I enjoy. Being the list-minded person I am, I've tried sorting out all manner of tops over the years and got hung up on a hard-set order. To think that any game would earn such affection to be gushed over in unique fashion seemed unlikely. And then, at 5:30 AM on April 24th, after over 100 hours of revisiting a trilogy I hold dear, I had a realization. I love Mass Effect. Specifically the game that left me in tears, with a pit in my stomach and a sense of loss no game has ever given me. Because I didn't want to leave the Milky Way or the friends I've known since I was in high school. But I had to. The journey was over. The Shepard I created was never going to grab another drink with Garrus, never again reminisce over battles with Rex, or be held by Lorra when the doubt became too much to bear alone. It was time to say goodbye, depart the Milky Way, and move on to Andromeda. It's safe to say that in 2017, Mass Effect Andromeda was overshadowed by a number of titles in what many, myself included, consider to be one of the best years of the last couple decades. Nier Automata, Breath of the Wild, Yakuza 0, Persona 5, PUBG, Doki Doki Literature Club, Horizon Zero Dawn, Super Mario Odyssey, and so much else ensured that anything less than great would feel unimpactful. Sadly, Andromeda is so much less than what we hoped. Launching in a shockingly broken state with Frankenstein models, janky animation, plenty of crashes, and game-breaking bugs. All of this turned many, even the most die-hard fans, completely off. Those who pushed past the opening few hours were met with a rote open-world design and writing inferior to what came before. On 2 prior occasions, I attempted to get into Andromeda, one at launch and a few months afterward. I felt burnt. Thinking back to Giant Bomb's 2017 Game of the Year deliberations, specifically the category of most disappointing game, in which Brad Shoemaker, in arguing for Andromeda being the clear-cut winner, uttered the deciding line: "They killed Mass Effect." And while slightly hyperbolic at the time, it has only proven to be more true with the passing of every day. Mass Effect, a series that dominated the 7th generation of consoles with innovative design and storytelling many used to proselytize a medium that was making major strides for mainstream acceptance. A franchise that spawned several spin-off games, numerous comics and novels, an anime, and even a theme park ride. But by May of that very year, just 2 months after Andromeda's launch, plans for the DLC were cancelled, and Mass Effect was put on indefinite hold. It's been roughly 3 years, and sometimes when given a second chance, games that were once deemed a disappointment make their rebound. BioWare being no stranger to this with Dragon Age 2, which leaves us with the question, is Mass Effect Andromeda that bad? And the answer is a little more mundane than you might think. So, as I've mentioned, Mass Effect Andromeda is a game I've felt quite poorly about for much of its existence. Given my recent replaying of the trilogy and how much more in love with it I am, I know I had to finally finish Andromeda. But I was also dreading it for obvious reasons. If anyone is primed to feel little but abject disappointment, it's me. Those first half a dozen or so hours are still far from good, if significantly less filled with faces of the uncanny valley and trans-dimensional bodies melded into space stations. It isn't long after that the Normandy stand-in, The Tempest, begins to feel a bit more like a home. The Nexus, the Citadel 2.0, becomes more like a living, breathing hub of culture. Bespoke narratives of individual lives, like spokes on a wheel it centers. And I started to think, Mass Effect Andromeda isn't as bad as I feared. Not only because of a healthy dosage of patches, but at its heart, it still employs so much of what makes BioWare BioWare, and what makes Mass Effect so special, even amongst their iconic catalog. You play as one of the 2 Ryder twins who inevitably attains the sole role as the most important person in the galaxy. It's still an RPG in which you gather party members across the course of the story. You pick 2 at a time to accompany you on any given mission, and they not only partake in combat, but chat with each other along the way, comment on the world around them, and the decisions you make, especially those big, iconic crossroads BioWare is known for. Combat, though less cover-based, has you wielding all sorts of force powers. When not on any given mission, you have your home base where you choose your next destination and can engage in deeper conversation with your party, in some instances even romance them. Andromeda is still a game propelled by its character and storytelling as you travel, meet new people from all sorts of cultures and walks of life, making choices that impact the very foundation of their worlds. Even some of the bigger areas of complaint aren't exactly new ground for BioWare. For example, Andromeda is not the first time they've handled open spaces. Dragon Age Inquisition was a big step in that direction and is still well regarded. This is just an attempt at an evolution of all of that. There are 5 planets ranging in scope that the player can wander around doing side quests, meeting characters, and so on. 4 of which can be colonized once you've met a viability threshold. Unlike the trilogy that predominantly had smaller, linear worlds with occasional branching paths. Even spaces you could navigate freely, like the Citadel, were purposely designed showcases that gave you a limited, yet distinct taste of not just what you saw, but everything you didn't too. This obviously brings us to the divide between linear and open design, both of which have their strengths and weaknesses. In the 8th generation of consoles, open worlds have become quite common, which speaks to what players have placed value upon as a far more complicated result than we'll go into here. Given some of the games I mentioned at the start of this video, I obviously enjoy spacious environments. However, the design ethos that spawned out of the likes of Assassin's Creed and Far Cry 3 taps into a major issue I often come across in the AAA space, not valuing the player's time. Giant maps littered with icons, towers to climb, enemy camps to take over, and all those other much maligned tropes. Such has contributed to what has been dubbed open world fatigue, where it becomes difficult to actually call these worlds as much as spaces, where square mileage becomes a back-of-the-box bullet point as well as the hours of potential gameplay. While I still think a number of games are falling victim to that in the past year or two, a shift has been happening since 2017. The big new defining moment in this type of design came from a developer who was marketing their first landmark attempt at such using the cliched line of, "You see that mountain in the distance? You can go there." Breath of the Wild to me is defined by its lack of explicit gamification. Nintendo made Hyrule stand out by doing so much of the opposite of what was popular, populating its enormous map with not much of anything, letting the sightlines, artistic direction, reserved sound design, and lack of player direction speak for itself. In Andromeda, it's much more about holding the player's hand and funneling them from point A to point B in order to complete a quest. Overbearing UI not only undercuts the visual splendor, but stands in antithesis to the sense of exploration. To illustrate this, I'm going to read an excerpt from an old blog of mine from my Game Informer community days. Link has to track down certain locations to reveal pieces of the past, in order to find out how Calamity Ganon was able to win 100 years ago. This is facilitated by the Sheikah Slate, essentially an iPad that contains pictures of key locations. Seeing how the world is massive and there is only one traveling old painter who gives you vague clues about each area, this can be difficult. There's a reliance on the player learning the landscape and navigating remote territories. As I set out from Hateno Village, a small town on the very southeastern outskirts of Hyrule, I estimate almost a full day's ride. I'm looking for grassy hills with a distinct old tree with a little alcove underneath. In the background, a sizable stone bridge and snow-capped desert peaks. As I approach my waypoint, I guide Shadowfax, that's what I've named my horse, off the beaten path and into the hills. I'm not entirely certain how far I'll get on horseback, but best not to leave my only means of quick escape hundreds of feet away if I encounter any danger. The sun begins to set, but I close in on the secluded target. Hill peak after hill peak, I line my approach towards the bridge with the photograph. Then I see it, a lone, twisted old tree at just the right angle. Shadowfax leisurely plods along, Sure enough, two little ancient statues nestle themselves in the alcove, as if they had taken shelter there 100 years ago when Ganon unleashed his malice upon Hyrule. At this moment, I feel more like Nathan Drake than Uncharted ever made me feel in 5 games. Andromeda doesn't lead navigation up to the player almost ever. If the bright orange and white objective icon isn't appearing on both the screen as well as the compass, then there are several different ways the game informs you to use your AI companion Sam to scan the area. Essentially, it's Witcher vision. There's never a sense of not knowing where to go or what's around the next corner. I don't care about any of that because I'm probably going to blow by it as quickly as possible in my space buggy, and not much of anything poses a compelling threat. No environmental hazards that feel like real otherworldly dangers as much as easily avoided survival mechanics. If you're exploring inhospitable terrain or large swaths of wilderness, you'd expect pushback from the natural world. As much as some malign the reign of Breath of the Wild, I really love how thematically fitting it is. It's Mother Nature's way of communicating to the player that it's a powerful force, capable of altering your plans in a way where you just have to find a spot to hunker down and pass the time. And if I'm being perfectly honest, Andromeda's planets don't feel all that alien. They're places you could see on Earth, or at most are rather generic sci-fi locales. When I think about the worlds that have truly enraptured me through environment design, like that of Made in Abyss, where every layer combines into one of the most haunting yet entrancing places in any piece of fiction, there are places I don't want to leave. That I want to look at every little plant and creature, that every hill and cave feels like it's the set for some iconic scene. Sure, there's probably a scientific argument to be made for how even planets in a distant galaxy might not differ much from what we know on Earth, but Andromeda doesn't even lean into the mundane realities of space like the trilogy did. Those barren planets of Mass Effect 1 are integral to setting a tone. That space, while mesmerizing, can also be predictably drab. This is supported by the numerous planets that have incredibly well written and brief descriptions, standing out as one of the defining examples of how seemingly inconsequential world building can form into something special. Early on in Andromeda, quests of any size generally stick to one planet in the Nexus. Though after a dozen or so hours, you've likely opened up numerous major planets within dozens of systems. This is abused to have the player jump from planet to planet to planet and then back again. For example, there's a mission on Kadara which is probably the worst case with the longest load times and extra steps it takes to leave the city and venture out into the wilds. You're helping out a local contact for the Andromeda Initiative on a planet full of people who have been exiled from the Nexus after an uprising. It's a particularly egregious mission that has you bouncing around the galaxy onto the Nexus, off the Nexus, out into the wilds of one planet, and then back to Kadara, seemingly only to repeat your steps. After running out into the wilderness of Kadara to get to a cave you spend all of maybe a minute in, the section of the quest is complete. Often when this happens, the mission is put on hold until you've met a specific requirement, whether that be advancing the main story or relationship with a character. So I head back to the Tempest, only to have the quest update telling me to call the very person I just left planetside. I do so, and they tell me to head back down. Okay, fine, but that means watching the gorgeous landing scene that has completely lost its luster because this is the 75th time I've seen it. Then those two damn doors, again, that each take 5 seconds to open. Again, 75th time each. Stumble my way to the quest marker, have an actually good bit of extended storytelling at a house party, and I'm almost ready to forgive all of the tedium. I head back to the Tempest as the mission is on hold once more. Loading, waiting, and walking included. Guess what? Yup, as soon as I step foot onto my ship, the mission is back on. Into the exact house the party was at, and to speak to someone I saw that last night. Now you might want to say I'm playing wrong, that I should just accept defeat at one of the many points I return to the Tempest and go on a handful of quests on another planet and come back to Kadara when enough is available there. And I did that often, but the problem is you sometimes exhaust the meaningful side content available until you advance the story. And the majority of the missions so often can be broken down by time investment in a way that is rather frustrating. You spend far more effort traveling to, sitting on a loading screen, waiting for doors, and so on, more so than any meaty material. That minute I spent in a cave for the Katara questline is often the case for anything. Sometimes those minuscule chunks of actual design end so unceremoniously that you wonder, why did I have to spend the last 10 minutes getting here, only to just be rushed off to the next location? Over the past couple weeks, I've been playing a fair amount of Final Fantasy XIV. Mass Effect Andromeda often boils down to a single-player RPG strapping on the design philosophy that defines the repetitive, time-consuming tedium of the MMORPG genre. I don't want to completely deny that Mass Effect could work in an open world, just that the execution here is honestly miserable. Coming fresh off the trilogy makes this really sting. Because in a place like Noveria, a side quest was just 30 to 50 steps away. You enter an office, have some dialogue, a fight ensues, or maybe not, and then you quickly return to the quest giver. It's tight and allows all this superb world building to feel far punchier and less diluted by wasteful travel time, where you tunnel vision your way from one objective marker to the next. There are certainly times I found myself enjoying the openness. After the not-so-great starting planet of Vios, a place of confined areas and rocky terrain that means actual square footage of traversable land is far less than it seems, the icy tundra of Vold is far better. What elevation exists is spaced out and paced so that management of driving modes is actually rather fun. Lots of flat space, turn on the speed mode, and rocket across a frozen lake. Snowy hills, switch on all-wheel drive, and surf across them. With some impressive sightlines and the imposing enemy fortress situated on the mountainside, it takes advantage of the text supporting such gorgeous scenery. When watching and reading a ton of opinions on Andromeda, especially other YouTubers, two words popped up in almost every video: smooth and fluid. Both are overused in games discussion, often being filler where lengthier and more unique appraisals would be helpful. There is also the matter that smooth or fluid combat isn't a universal plus, like so many tossing the descriptors around imply. Weight and heft are just as valuable, clunkiness or unwieldiness too. Game feel is more than just an optimization of player control to the point where all friction has been sanded down to a minimum. From Software is the obvious example in regards to the momentum and weight-based combat, but Grow Home and its sequel Grow Up wouldn't be as good as they are if you had great control over the little red robot. The fact that it controls like a thumb toy doll barely held together makes the act of navigation and failure all the more endearing and satisfying. Andromeda being described as the pinnacle of Mass Effect combat presents such a myopic view. Not everything needs to be fluid, and a lot of stuff that is, Andromeda included, is largely buttery smooth nothingness. Something you engage with at ease, gazing at its flashiness that becomes increasingly rote over the course of 50 hours. I don't strongly dislike it, it's fine, okay, because it doesn't imbue me with much of any feelings. Meanwhile, scenarios in the open world of Havarl are genuinely terrible. A perfect example of Andromeda's combination of unrefined concepts in disunison. Firstly, planets don't have day-night cycles. This dense jungle of overdesign mixed with darkened visuals make target identification troublesome. I found myself firing not at models, but into the darkness below a floating health bar. Worse yet is how a second or third mob of enemies might join in a fight, causing you to be surrounded and die from what feels like an unavoidable interaction. Power combination is undoubtedly more visually impressive and open-ended, but suffers as a result of the open design. Barring Havarl, most enemy encounters on any given planet take place in wide open spaces where surfaceable AI are given more room to spread out. Meaning the area of effect focus from the resulting chaining of the not Jedi powers mean you don't get mass destruction as much as I'd like. I prefer Mass Effect 3 with the tight confines of most of its combat arenas. When I replayed it last April, it was so damn fun to launch out my biotic powers, use a charge, and then blast away with a hefty shotgun. You could streak successive kills far more often. These spaces do exist in some key story missions and proved to be the best encounters of Andromeda, which are broken up unfortunately by Crash Bandicoot style platforming. You so often are clearly in position to just barely land on a surface only to watch your feet slip by, then your hands that are supposed to latch onto surfaces, and well, now you're falling to your death. One of the key focuses of Andromeda's open design is of course the process of colonizing a planet. which consists of doing a handful of side-ish missions to increase viability until it hits a bare minimum for settlement. Then you drive to the predetermined location of said settlement and boom, a bunch of prefab buildings with new characters and quests. It isn't very fleshed out though, and missions you do take on to make one planet viable don't vary much from another. The most compelling aspect of all of this is the choice you're presented with after the first successful outpost on Eos. You have to decide where to take the focus of the Andromeda initiative with its first truly hopeful new home, military or science. Presented as if this is one of those iconic BioWare choices, even unlocking a new mechanic afterwards where you now get to decide who comes out of stasis. There are roughly a dozen groups between each of the three overarching options: military, science, and economic. There's even a little side mission afterwards where the workers of the Nexus strike because they feel like their families have been skipped over for folks with political ties. It all seems like it's building towards this fascinating space colonization sim, where the original plan has been thrown out the window. Will we come to Andromeda as military conquerors, engage in trade relations, or focus on understanding the new home through advanced science? That's not what Andromeda is though. The choice between making the EO's outpost focus on military or science never comes back into play. That's the only time you make any such decision. The matter of stasis becomes a near meaningless stat bonus. There is no more unrest, no more quests like ruling in on the first murder case. Much of that falls away in favor of writing that is derivative, spotty, and lacking that spark of life and culture that defined the trilogy. The opening few hours of Andromeda leave a terrible first impression. It hardly feels like Mass Effect. It doesn't have the tone. While the separate OSTs of the trilogy varied in styles and quality, its orchestral pieces didn't feel so empty. What took me longer to put my finger on, though, is the voice direction. It's inconsistent and clashing with what came before. I think that's because the first major Solarian and Asari you meet are stunt casted. Jaren Tan is Kumail Nanjiani, and Dr. Alexa Tapero is Natalie Dormer. Which isn't to say they do a bad job, just that my mind immediately goes to thinking about them rather than the aliens in front of me. In general, Solarians aren't as nasally, nor are the Krogan as gravelly. There's a lot to be said about this. No culture or race is a monolith, but little cracks tend to spread and undercut the foundation. Worse though is the familiarity and comfort that everyone seems to have with one another. To explain this, we've got to talk about some of the Mass Effect timeline. The first Mass Effect takes place in 2183, whereas Mass Effect 2 ends in 2185. That's the same year the Andromeda Initiative launched. In Mass Effect 2, Shepard and much of humanity is still getting to know those they share the Milky Way with, and there's a whole lot of distrust. That isn't the case here. Well, not until it needs to be for plot reasons. There isn't much awkwardness or questioning of Ryder's part, which I see as less of an issue, but more so a noticeable shift in tone. If the player character isn't a little lost fish in a big ocean, then there is inherently a bit less wonder and discovery to it all. Future Mass Effects were always going to run into this issue as some degree of franchise lore became known amongst the fandom. As much as you want to ease new players in, you can't very well force the millions who already know Asari are monogendered, of the Rachni Wars, or how quantum entanglement communication works to sit through the same. Andromeda goes too far in the hand-waving direction though, never really diving into the nitty-gritty of the sci-fi or history that define the galaxy. Just assuming the player will accept it all as space magic or bring the familiarity they might have with other advanced technology from other fictional universes, blindly accepting what's in front of them. That's the thing though, the trilogy rarely relied on such. If you were to compare Mass Effect to another pop culture franchise, in a lot of ways there is a mirroring of Star Wars. In terms of fleshing out the galaxy though, it's always reminded me of The Lord of the Rings, and the dedication of realizing that world Tolkien had. Mass Effect doesn't go quite as far as coming up with entirely new languages, but it still has the same question at its heart. Why are things the way they are? The Asari aren't just wise, rather they live to be 1,000 years old, and their species reproduction is largely reliant on interspecies mingling with the intention of learning from others. But why don't the Krogan, who also live similar lifespans, have the same presumed wisdom? They were never given the chance after the Solarians pushed them into being a spacefaring people in order to fight back the Rachni, only to have the genophage, a form of population control through genetic modification, thus dooming the Krogan to centuries of internal power struggles that pushed large swaths of their dwindling population into mercenary work. Andromeda barely expands or reflects upon any of the baggage the people of the Milky Way bring with them to this new galaxy, nor does it have anything so compelling that already existed in the Andromeda galaxy, which is where this video comes to the discussion of the Ket, Angaran, and Remnant. So, the Andromeda Initiative, a multi-species private organization, wakes up 600 years later in the, you guessed it, Andromeda galaxy. They're surprised to find the planets they thought to be habitable are very much not. As one of the Ryder twins, you follow your father, Alec Ryder, to the intended new homeworld of humanity. Daddy Dearest is a pathfinder, which essentially means he's the lead explorer and problem solver for humans, with each race having their own pathfinder, an ARC ship carrying roughly 20,000 colonists. Of course, Dad dies, passing on the power of his artificial intelligence, Sam, to you, and now you've been thrusted into an elite role. Upon docking at the Nexus, which arrived before the ARCs, you find that everyone's had a really hard time in Andromeda. But wait, there's an ancient alien technology here and another species of hostile aliens. It is here that the similarities really start to grow tiresome and the differences unimpressive. For starters, the super advanced race of aliens that has seemingly vanished despite their technological prowess have the ever so creative name of the Remnant. Your rider, meanwhile, in the accident that caused the piece of old tech to go haywire, costing your father's life, has provided you with a special connection to that ancient race, which attracts a young Asari scientist to your team who we'll get into later. Meanwhile, the Ket become immediately hostile to the Milky Way colonists who have two defining qualities. Firstly, early on you discover they like to raid worlds of other species, kidnap them, put them into pods, and then biologically alter them into a variation of their own species, which you inevitably will fight. Yes, this does indeed sound like a melding of the Collector and Reaper lore. Specifically, that last bit comes into play when Cora, your second in command, has a line that is nearly identical to one from Mass Effect 3. She describes them as the worst kind of enemy that makes you fight your own people. To stop them, you've got to solve everyone's problems and join all the species together in a united front, despite their mistrust of each other. Admittedly, the trilogy doesn't have the most original plot, but it understands that you can make such a story compelling when you have great characters and world building for the audience to care about. As for the Angaran, well, they're very emotional people. I know that because of how often they tell Ryder how emotional they are in an unemotional voice. I want to drag the Angarans all together. Jal, who becomes a squad member, is actually pretty great. He's got this whole inferiority complex given his lineage and achievements of his brother, which is compounded by but also takes on an interesting angle when he becomes the Angaran liaison to Ryder's team. The whole bit where the Rokar, a splinter faction of Angarans who resist not only the Ket but the newcomers as well, should have been the main antagonists of the game, because yeah, the Rokar aren't exactly wrong to distrust or push back against outsiders. The Andromeda Initiative, even if not so violently taking over the galaxy, are still coming to a place that isn't theirs and expect to settle right in. It's the one spot of this entire game that is willing to actually criticize the colonization spirit at the heart of the Andromeda Initiative even just a little bit. What further complicates this is how Ryder's first contact with the Angaran plays out in an underwhelming fashion. When they arrive at the Angaran capital city, they step off their ship to an unrecognizable language. Within 30 seconds though, another Angaran comes along, and what do you hear? English, which Ryder never questions. So at best, the explanation would be either Sam deciphers the entire language and is now auto-translating after maybe 20 words of spoken Angaran being heard, or the Angaran are somehow knowledgeable of English. This sort of stuff got explained in the original trilogy. Not only how all the different species of the Citadel space communicate, but even new races too. In Mass Effect 1, while on the Prothean ruined planet of Ilos, you come across a virtual intelligence. The Protheans haven't existed for a very, very long time. But in one sentence, the VI explains that it can communicate with you because it has been monitoring your communications since your arrival on the planet 30 minutes or so ago. Andromeda doesn't do that sort of writing. There are also so few cultural or technological differences that create hangups big or small. They just know what an AI is. The topic of biotics hardly gets any mention. They don't feel alien. They don't feel Mass Effect. At some point, BioWare needs to address the fact that Mass Effect does not need to be a human-centric story. It made sense for the original trilogy. Players could be introduced to the lore while sharing in the newcomer perspective. Marketability is the obvious concern for the number counters, and slapping a handsome white dude in the marketing is the boring result. Time constraints are another issue, and I can only imagine how much more stress the developers would have been under if they had to include the possibility of playing as one of the other species. However, I sure would love to see the day come where, even if we don't get a choice, Mass Effect puts the players in the role of an Asari, or hell, even an Elcor. That would be pretty alright too. While I did mention earlier that the patches have largely fixed game-breaking issues, textures, models, and so on, there are still some oddities. Probably the most annoying being that Ryder's eyelashes look glued onto their eyelids and clip in some funky ways. It's such a small issue, honestly, that you only notice in the right angles, but you do spend a whole lot of time looking at their face, so understandable if it bothers you. The over-animation is still here, though some of the most memed on instances were never as uniquely terrible as the internet would have you believe. And NPCs do zip around the world from time to time, like I said, unslightly, but nothing so devastating like the quest triggers breaking, falling through the map, or the milieu of other technical issues at launch. What does bother me though is the audio. The atmosphere a club or bar gives off is often due to its music that draws a line between it and the outside world. Now imagine you're down the street and those thumping bass drops are now just as loud as they were inside the club. Imagine they're louder than the person talking to you 5 feet away. To bring up another comparison to the trilogy, if a squadmate had ambient dialogue and they were more than 30 feet away from you, the chatter would turn to radio comms. If they got close, it would go back to a normal voice. Andromeda just has a normal voice at the same decibel, no matter the distance sometimes. That is until it does take into account your squadmate's distance at the worst times. Someone will try to chime in on an important mission detail or say something interesting where they're 100 feet away and you can't hear them. Meaning subtitles are a must, and that's just more and more piece of guff on the screen along with all the UI that is covering up some of the impressive visuals. Voice line triggering is also a mess. On top of doubling up lines, someone will be wildly out of context at times. For example, Sam remarks about potential settlement locations when out and about on open world planets. While landing at the very settlement of a planet I had already settled, Sam just blurts out, "This would be a great spot for a settlement." Worst of all in this regard is how often the game cuts itself off. Now, if you're writing ambient dialogue for team members in a game where they'll remark about their surroundings and so on, you have to keep this in mind. You don't want to trigger a 15-second conversation between two squadmates at the start of a hallway that takes the player 10 seconds to move through, and on the other side of the door is a cutscene or combat scenario that cuts off the ambient chatter. This happens all of the time. It's particularly frustrating because this sort of dialogue has long been one of the things I love about BioWare. It's an excellent way to let the player in on some details of the world, flesh out the cast, and show off the relationships between crew members. Andromeda even has some of the best new ideas around this from any of the studio's titles to date. They just make such a profoundly odd fundamental error. So we're now like 6,000 words into the script for this video, and you might be wondering about when Andromeda stops being that bad. Sadly, where Andromeda shines brightest is in the spots that it doesn't stray far from the old tenets of BioWare, which is pretty darn frustrating. The whole gather a crew, go on missions together, and most importantly, just hang around stuff is fantastic. I've been building up my team since I played Knights of the Old Republic back on the original Xbox in like 2004. I've been walking around ships, camps, and all manner of home bases, spot by spot, to talk to a crew one by one after every big mission to see if they have any new conversations. And all that still really works for me. Honestly, the systems around such and the ways it's evolved is the strongest BioWare has ever done. In Mass Effect 3, some big changes in this regard were made. You could find Garrus in the dining hall, or hear Liara and Tali chatting over comms while standing on different decks of the Normandy. When you went back to the Citadel, you didn't take a team with you anymore. Rather, they were all around the station. This made them feel more alive and more individualistic than ever before. Andromeda takes all that and goes further. Now you'll see your team members not only in different locations around the ship, but walking around as well. A door opens up and it's like they're taking their places on stage to perform a conversation with you or someone else. Now not only is your team out and about on the main hub, but any friendly port city. I love how BioWare takes advantage of all the time you spend in the Nomad. With each pairing of the team, you get unique dialogue between them that further characterizes. In particular, I enjoyed the bond between PB the Asari and Drac the Krogan, both of whom are two individuals among different species that live to be roughly 1,000 years old, but are all on opposite sides of that lifespan. Drac is the cranky grandpa who takes a shine to the young Asari's devil-may-care attitude, but also provides some thoughtful wisdom. In general, the crew are far more involved with each other in all manner of ways, forming distinct friendships like that I just mentioned, or the bros being bros bond that happens between Jal and Liam. Within a few hours, I ended up not even minding Ryder all that much. The dialogue system that is reduced down to symbols representing vague emotions was a bad choice, but eventually I got the gist of it. Yes, Ryder is written in such a way that they're a pretty distinct character by the time the player has any say, which means you're less so coming up with a main character of your own, and more so accenting and refining. I find this to be a good middle ground between a blank slate that ends up putting the developers in so many weird positions, and having the very tightly written protagonist. I played as the brother Scott Ryder and leaned into his Boy Scoutish nature, making him a bit of a dorky company man, but also knowing when to break the constraints of the problematic systems that often care for the wealthy few over the many. His thirst for adventure got him in trouble with his mission and personal life at times, but he had a strong moral code that allowed him to be more empathetic than most. And for those who think Shepard was far more of a blank slate, I'd highly encourage you to go back to the trilogy. They're constrained in a lot of ways as you would suspect a career soldier would be, which didn't stop me from making my most recent Shepard into a major Kusanagi of sorts. She spent her life dedicated to the mission and was only able to come to terms with the trauma she had suffered and had made others suffer through the events of the war against the Reapers. While Andromeda's writing left me feeling far less connected to Ryder than I had Shepard, I far prefer this protagonist over the majority of AAA leads. There are absolutely aspects I don't care for in the characterization of the Tempest crew. There was much criticism of the style of dialogue around the time of the release, and I totally see why. At times it feels very specific to a year or two prior to the game coming out, which what I mean by the former can be summed up with a few examples of both Ryder and PB's dialogue. At one point, Ryder drops a "fucks to give" line, and PB unironically describes his sweater as fugly. It's reassuring to know that if I somehow get cryogenically frozen for over a millennium, my slang will still be in style, but yeah. A fair portion of Andromeda's writing is so young millennial on the internet in 2015, which understandably feels out of place. There's also the matter of characters like Drac, Vetra, and the other alien crew members specifically using human idioms and references in a way that feels less like they reference something they know from human culture and more like it's a reference from their own. The Turian Vetra has an exchange with Drac where he's being a particularly grumpy old man, going on about back in his day sort of stuff. She ends it by pleading with him not to say walked uphill both ways. And then there's PB's line about Yar pirates versus Shooty pirates. There are just enough of those lines that stand out and are never questioned by any of the humans that make them feel like some sort of weird universe retcon. Again, the original trilogy absolutely has alien characters using distinctly human references and cultural ideas. but there's a degree of self-awareness. With PB, Andromeda even has a decent enough excuse given how she's fascinated by other cultures. They could have just thrown in a line about how she spent some time watching human cinema or anything of that sort. Quibbles about dialogue aside, I do genuinely enjoy the crew of the Tempest. I don't believe any one member stacks up to the best of Mass Effect 1 through 3, but they'd all absolutely slip into those casts just fine. Loyalty missions are reintroduced to the series, making for some of the best character writing and set pieces. Romance options are opened up entirely. While I'd argue specifically writing a character with their sexuality can be interesting, this approach leans into player-guided storytelling in a welcoming way. Unlike Mass Effect 1, where sex is partly portrayed as some sort of endgame reward, the progression and diversity of styles to these relationships are nice. For example, you could just have casual sex with PB and then move on to a more intimate relationship with someone else if you so choose. And then there are options outside of your crew too, that are just as open. When I had that early morning moment with Mass Effect 3 that left a hole in my gut for quite a few days, much of that came from these small moments. One of my favorites being around the middle of the game where Lorra enters Shepard's room on the Normandy to discuss the time capsule she's making for future civilizations, just in case the Reapers win. Lorra tells Shepard she's including a data entry about her, asking how she wants to be remembered, and I just sat there for a few minutes, thinking about how damn well this internal crisis defined the character I had been crafting for nearly 100 hours. What it meant for Shepard to have the person she holds so dear ask her how she views herself. It's a truly fantastic example of how powerful the original trilogy can be when it so wonderfully melds the in-house Bioware storytelling with that of the player's headcanon. Now, Andromeda never really gets that heavy, and we'll get to that later. However, it does have scenes quite like that of the Citadel DLC of Mass Effect 3, which culminates in a house party with numerous faces you met over the course of the trilogy in attendance. It's a cheesy fanservice moment, but highlights one of the greatest strengths of BioWare of old. Those times where you just get to hang out with your virtual friends. So towards the end of Andromeda, the culmination of a bunch of small quests to organize a movie night on the Tempest comes to fruition. You and the entire crew gather in Ryder's cabin that looks out into the vast abyss of space. The lights are dimmed, the projector and screen set. The couch pulled up, but there's not enough room for everyone, so some gather on the floor in front. Huddled together in this point of their existence where they can forget that they've traveled across the universe for 600 years, leaving practically everything they've known behind for a future that isn't certain. In this little imperfect moment, they just get to be a group of coworkers turned friends, eating snacks and watching some laughably terrible movie together, arguing if they should fast forward to the good parts and poorly reenacting the worst. As the screen illuminates their increasingly tired faces, Ryder looks around at what they have, and the person cuddled up next to them on the couch that they love. Genuinely, this is one of my favorite scenes from the entire franchise. The sort of stuff that pushes me to dive into a medium I've not before. I asked a friend who is also a huge Mass Effect fan to recommend me some fanfic, because after scenes like this, I realize how much I love this franchise and just want to spend as much time with the characters and worlds as I can. As my roughly 50-hour playthrough of Andromeda was coming to a close, I felt conflicted. There was a ton wrong, and it disrespects the player's time in many ways that would usually make me drop a game like that in a heartbeat. But it made me realize how much of a time and place thing our reception of a piece of media can be. Maybe before now I just wasn't in the headspace to play a big experience compromised by so much tedium. Undoubtedly, one of the benefits of being shut inside these days is that I've been playing games like I used to, hours on end, actually finishing what I have any desire to finish, dropping what I want to when I want, not needing to see things through to the finish line as if I'm being some part of a cultural moment. It was also around this time that one of the major themes really started to resonate. Every single person who joined the Andromeda Initiative gave up their old lives for something new, and it really stuck with me. BioWare was doing the same. It would have been the easy choice to capitalize on the success of the trilogy, the security of what they already had passed on by those who came before, but they opted to take a chance. Unfortunately, things didn't go so well. The choice of leaving the Milky Way was a bold one that ended in failure. As a creative, I can sympathize. This wasn't the same team out of Edmonton that was responsible for the first 3 games, but a new one with new staff based out of Montreal. They wanted to craft something of their own. The hellish development of such has been well documented, and I encourage anyone who is interested to read the finer details over on Kotaku. Jason Schreier has a terrific investigative write-up that I have linked in the description below. It's the prototypical story of a game and its developers who fell victim to the business whims of a big publisher. Inner office politics, understaffing, leadership changes, creative restructuring, including massive crunch. Maybe the most telling issue being how the Frostbite engine, a fantastic tool DICE has used to great effect for their first-person shooters, was so fundamentally not designed for an RPG that BioWare struggled to implement basic features like party and inventory management. The reception to Mass Effect 3 looms large over Andromeda. Both Shepard and the Reapers are that which will not be named for the vast majority of the game, held back for some late twists that don't really land. And in a way, Andromeda is partly the fault of the Mass Effect community. One of the most infamous cases of how completely callous, entitled, and petulant the gaming audience at large can be. At the time, I didn't much care for the final 15 minutes either, but recognized that the entirety of that game is the culmination of the series. To put so much weight upon what happens in the final fraction of it goes to show how incapable that fandom is of a reading that which goes beyond a surface layer interpretation of the plot. The most popular mod on nexusmods.com is the happy ending, which speaks to the criticism people have over how even the full battle readiness, optimal play, min-maxing of the Paragon and Renegade system, that the outcome is never truly a happy ending. A lot goes wrong in Mass Effect 3. Fan-favorite characters have doomed fates, worlds are destroyed, species obliterated. Shepard and their crew are on the front lines, and you don't get the final ride off into the blackness of space together. Unsurprisingly, BioWare didn't want to go anywhere close to that cesspit of fandom, so they specifically state that the Andromeda Initiative leaves the Milky Way at a point in the timeline where fans were coming off what many consider to be the best part of the entire series, that being the suicide mission of ME2. While I disagree with that entire statement, I do agree with fanbyte writer Kenneth Shepard's belief that the potential for a deathless suicide mission largely poised the community to push back on Mass Effect 3's tragic outcomes, paving the way for Andromeda's more upbeat attitude that never finds its footing and fans bemoan. And yes, given the technical instability of Andromeda at launch, it wasn't even a decent game, but it is now. Despite that, the narrative around such really hasn't changed. It's still cited all over the internet as one of the most disappointing games of the last decade. A sentiment I actually agree with, but also recognize that it's still a fine game. Given how events have transpired at BioWare these last few years, it's a rather sad state of affairs for the developer that once sat atop the industry. An exodus of its leadership met with a steady decline in the reception of their work, going nearly all hands on deck for what was purported to be a revolutionary shakeup for the studio, even bringing back Casey Hudson, who had directed the Mass Effect trilogy, to spearhead their efforts once more. And while we all know how Anthem ended up, with the impact COVID-19 has had on game development, I can only speculate their plans to revive the massive financial and critical flop have become more difficult. Meanwhile, the teaser for the next Dragon Age was released at E3 2018, but rumor is with a troubled development, what might be the studio's last hope is still a couple years off. And now we've got some pretty reliable reports that publisher EA is planning on a Mass Effect trilogy remaster set for early 2021. Call me cynical, but given EA's history with buying and shuttering great studios, this all feels like them weighing the value of what BioWare and its IPs have left. BioWare had described Andromeda as a semi-standalone experience, but given the number of major unresolved plotlines in regards to the mystery around the Andromeda Initiative, it's clear they had always intended for a proper sequel. But it's hard to imagine EA or BioWare would dare to revisit the Andromeda Galaxy, which does make me a little sad, because there's something there. Something that, even if it didn't launch in such a messy state, I think we could have already received the ideal sequel that takes the rough ideas and polishes them into something special. When thinking about my nostalgia for Mass Effect, I often come back to one point in particular. The first time the credits began rolling and the song M4 Part 2 plays, we stepped into something truly new and never achieved before. A game with storytelling chops spearheading the medium, not just choice-driven narrative, but the promise that the actions you took would span a trilogy. And I think it's important to reflect on how profound the notion of save importation was and still is, because so few have even attempted it since, especially in such a bold fashion. I hope that someday Mass Effect inspires that same sort of spirit and wonderment again. It would be an utter travesty if the last of the world many of us hold so dear is disappointment. Because the real shock isn't that Andromeda isn't a great game, but that Mass Effect could be anything less than transcending. So, that was a long one. As you might imagine, this video has been far and away the most work I've ever done for this channel, because in the future I would like to do more videos about video games. Maybe even someday finally explaining why I think Mass Effect 3 is the best Mass Effect and Mass Effect 2 is very good, but that ending's not so great. So if such a thing sounds interesting to you, then maybe consider donating to my Patreon. Times are rough for a whole number of reasons, and a lack of financial security can be troublesome to producing these videos. So even if you only have $1 to spare, that still would be greatly appreciated. As always, thank you to those who have given already and have supported this channel. I am a little surprised I've made it as far as I have. This wouldn't be the case without all of your support.